local foods and small farms educator, and I cover Daviess-Stephenson and Winnebago counties. This Fruit on Friday series is one we have talked a lot about over the last couple of years, as a lot of folks just continually have questions when it comes to growing fruits in Northern Illinois. And so what I really wanted to do with this series was to break up the different fruits that you can grow and zero in on some of the things that you need to consider when it comes to growing them. What I was really hoping for with this series was to also help address those who are thinking about planting the fruit in this upcoming season, as well as those who also currently have fruit that they might be growing. So we kind of hope to address kind of both those groups, those that have felt for some time that they want to put fruit in kind of a backyard, non-commercial setting, as well as those that maybe are currently dealing with some fruit issues in their setting as well with it. That's kind of what we're aiming for with this. And today's topic is going to be apples and pears. And the reason that we're combining both apples and pears is that they have very similar qualities when it comes to their growth, when it comes to diseases, when it comes to pruning, when it comes to just kind of all of those kind of things we think about when it comes to growing them successfully. So that's what we're going to try to do today. So you received an email with today's handout, and you'll have those handouts as we go along. You can certainly feel free to use those. But today's plan is going to give us a couple of things. I want to get into kind of general practices and production. And that's going to be kind of the core, if you will, of our apples and pears presentation, as some of the things that you need to consider when it comes to growing them in Northern Illinois and in our growing area, as well as thinking about different cultivars that you might want to grow, some of the decisions that you have to make in order to have good success with growing these pretty well too. We'll spend a little bit of time on pruning, and I know that some of you all are signed up for additional fruit tree pruning classes coming up in the next couple of weeks, and that will be really at the heart of what a lot of more the pruning focus will be. So today will be a little bit of a tease, if you will, when it comes to pruning these. I myself do a lot of work with insects and disease in fruits and vegetable production in Northern Illinois, and so you're going to hear a lot of that today for some of those insects and diseases. If you are growing apples and pears, there's a very strong chance that you're already encountering a number of these insects and diseases. And for some of y'all that might be looking to grow this group, this may really help you determine whether or not it's going to work out well for you, depending on if you're kind of willing to kind of accept that disease and insects are kind of one of those things that apples and pears get hit really hard with. We'll do a little bit about harvest at the end as we go along today too. So when we talk about apples and pears, they're really one of the group of fruit trees that just does very well in Northern Illinois. We have those on a commercial scale, big orchards in our area, as well as those in a backyard setting where year after year, they're getting some good yields when it comes to growing apples and pears. So it's one that we certainly usually will recommend if folks are interested in putting fruit in the backyard. We find that they are pretty consistent in their yields year to year. So while we do have sometimes that late frost, which I'll talk about today, we still find that they're very consistent if kind of everything is right for them. One of the other great things about apples and pears is that both of them tend to have the ability to grow a particular variety that you want and be able to grow it on a dwarf or a semi-dwarf tree. I think that's one of the great benefits here is that you're not necessarily stuck with maybe growing a standard tree that might get 20, 25 feet tall. You can grow these pretty successfully on a dwarf and semi-dwarf tree. And it also has some disease resistance, which is great, especially for our area. One of the other benefits is that there's just many different varieties available to you. There's always new varieties in online nurseries, at the nursery down the street from you, that are available each year. And I think that's one of the things that's really beneficial in growing is that you can try different varieties and find some that really works for you. Most cases when it comes to actually growing this type of fruit tree in the backyard or a smaller area that you might have, the soil really doesn't need much modification. While we still recommend getting a soil test every year if you are going to plant a perennial tree like our apple and pear, We do find that the soil is just very rich, it's very fertile, and folks sometimes don't get soil tests, even though we'd like you to get a soil test before you plant. Now, what are the challenges? There's always got to be some issue with the fruits and vegetables that we grow in Northern Illinois. And certainly this group has some issues. The late spring frost that we encounter in Northern Illinois, that April, sometimes mid-May, can really hurt some of the buds of the apple and pear trees as they're starting to emerge and as they're starting to flower. So that is something that you have to be cautious of, is that there may be some years where you lose some of your crop of apple and pear due to a late spring frost. And that's just something that we'll encounter, and we'll talk a little bit more about that going forward. There are also some years where disease and insect issues are really hard to manage. And you may find that for every fruit that you have on that tree, it is covered in insect damage, or you have continual issues with certain diseases. There also is some challenges when it comes to standard trees. And what I mean here is that, the standard tree that might reach 20, 25 feet at maturity may work great for you for maybe the first 5 or 10 years. But as that tree gets taller, it can be very hard to prune it properly. It can also be very hard to manage disease on that tree as it gets taller and taller. And so I know a lot of folks in Joe Davis County, Stephenson and Winnebago, we do see that a lot of folks are starting to move away from the standard trees. And really at this point, U of I Extension would try to recommend more of a dwarf, semi-dwarf tree compared to those standard trees, just thinking of long-term applicability with it. Another thing to consider is that you still want to prune these trees yearly. Now, the first couple of years may not be a lot of pruning, but for years to come, for the whole life of that tree, we've really encouraged you to be pruning that tree and getting it into the best shape for you. There's also very finicky varieties, one of which is Honeycrisp. We get reports from homeowners that it may take 7 or 8 years before they're getting consistent yields in their Honeycrisp apple trees that they have planted. Other folks have better success, of course, but we do hear anecdotally that there are some varieties that are just finicky. And as we think about our area, where some years we have a drought, some years we have very cold weather, much colder than we're experiencing this year, and that can all play an impact when it comes to very young trees getting established in the soil with that. One other thing to mention is that you need more than one variety. You're always going to be recommended to have more than one variety of an apple and a pear. And we'll talk more about this going forward, but that was sometimes what you encounter. Both apples and pears are really not ones where you could put out just one tree in the backyard and be done with it. You really are going to need more than one variety in order to get yield successfully. So thinking about cultivars then, there's always new ones available to you. You're always going to find new ones on the market, some that come highly recommended and some that can really work for you. One of the keys to think about is what that growth feature is. As you're looking through the catalogs, as you're looking through the websites, think about how tall this tree is going to get at maturity. So standard tree, 20 to 25 feet. A semi-dwarf tree, we see it maturing in year 4 or 5, about 12 to 15 feet. And then dwarf trees are 6 to 8 feet. One of the rules of thumb when it comes to actually spacing these trees is spacing them from tree to tree, from trunk to trunk, based on the expected height. So if I'm thinking about fruit trees in the backyard, I can space my semi-dwarf trees probably about 12 to 15 feet between each, down a row and across from each other. Dwarf trees, I would probably space it about 8 to 10 feet, even though you could get away with 6 feet. 6 feet's just very close for them. But that can give you some better context in thinking about how much room you have for fruit trees in your growing area, is always thinking about how tall they're going to get rather. It's important to note susceptibilities. What is it prone to disease issues for? And then we always recommend ordering from a reputable nursery or getting from a greenhouse in your growing area. They tend to do really well. We have good success stories of folks ordering from places like Jung's, from Stark Brothers, from many other nurseries. Just be mindful of where you're ordering from. Most of them will also have sometimes a money back guarantee, which is very nice for these fruit trees as you're planting this spring. I always encourage folks to also think about that long-term impact of a standard tree and really the dwarf and semi-dwarf tree. Think about, how this tree is going to look for those years to come and what we hope sometimes is decades to come. U of I Extension still has some recommended cultivars of apples, and you can see from this list, I've tried to place them into different categories based on when we expect them to yield, as well as what we might actually use with them. So that would be, of course, what we want you to do. We want you to have an apple that you are planning to eat fresh or one that you want to cook with, as well as kind of when you might expect to harvest from. Sometimes those Viking transparent or yellow transparent tend to be some of the earliest yielding ones. Sometimes mid-July to the first couple of weeks of, August is when we see it. We think about more of an early fall group. That might be, say, the end of August into parts of September, mid-September. A fall eating one would certainly be a very mid-October is when we expect. And finally, a winter eating apple might be one of our latest ones, either the end of October and into parts of November. You see on this list very similar or rather familiar ones: Jonathan, Jonagold, Bougie, Enterprise, Brayburn, many very common ones that we still recommend are good cultivars for our growing area. Some of the newer ones to mention, and I put newer ones with an asterisk because some of these are a little bit, they're still maybe 10 or 15 years old, and yet we still might classify them as a newer cultivar because we don't see them as often in backyards. Pixie Crunch is the one that you see here in this photo. This is a Midwestern variety, comes from Purdue, and it's a very small apple. That name Pixie is that it was really designed, or rather bred, for children to hold in their hand, a very small apple. And you compare that to some of the bigger apples that you see at grocery stores and at orchard. This is going to be a smaller apple that tastes very good. I really like the flavor of it. Zestar comes from Minnesota. A lot of the Minnesota varieties are really winter hardy, along with Snowsweet. Snowsweet is also a Minnesota variety. Crimson Crisp is one I really like quite a bit with a good flavor. You see it sold through Jung's. I think it's also sold through Stark Brothers. And then another one to mention is Ginger Gold. Just a couple ones out there that are newer, if you will. I always encourage folks to try to taste test at orchards if you can, although keep in mind that some of the varieties at orchards are not available to you to purchase as a tree. They're exclusive to growers, one of which is Evercrisp. Evercrisp is a really great tasting apple, and yet it's not available just yet for backyard production. But yeah, always new ones each year, and just some are not always available. That's really what you're going to encounter. But now is the time to start looking for these cultivars and seeing what's available to you to purchase and plant this upcoming season. With pear cultivars, we have a limited amount. You compare that to hundreds, sometimes it feels like, of apple varieties. And yet for pears, we are pretty limited with the amount of cultivars that are available to us. This European pear classification is very traditional looking pear, kind of what you expect when it comes to these pears. Some of these are Maxine, you see Seckel, you see Anjou, Moonglow, Kiefer, some very common pears that a lot of folks grow in Northern Illinois, as well as ones that you would find at that grocery store too. The Bartlett pear is one that grows fine in our area, but there's some issues with growing with it, especially some disease problems of fire blight, which we'll talk about today. And be cautious of that because it has that vulnerability and it can be very hard to control that disease. What we have really seen over the last 5 to 10 years is that a lot of people that have Bartlett pears in the backyard are removing these trees because the fire blight disease is so severe. And I'll show you photos of what that looks like. The Asian pear group is a little bit different. So it's still going to have that kind of pear-like taste to it, but it has a bit of an apple-like shape. There's some other differences I'll talk about going forward today with the Asian pears too. Certainly flavor can be a little bit different, a bit of a sandy texture. It's usually very sweet. It has kind of this common russet appearance, which is what you see here on in the photo here, kind of a rougher skin to it. It was also one that will ripen on the vine. So most of the time, when we talk about those European pears, we're going to harvest them and ripen them off the vine. And yet Asian pears will actually be ripened on that vine. A couple of recommended varieties. 20th century is one we see a lot in catalogs, like in Jung Seeds and Stark Brothers and so many others. We also see Peggy as one and Dan Bay. People really like those varieties too. We've also had a lot of folks ask about cider and hard cider. I think that's one of the new areas that people are thinking more about. And in simplistic terms, sometimes making your own cider is just combining a sweet and a tart apple and going from there. Maybe playing around with, how much of one particular cultivar you put in that cider mixture. And yet that's pretty simple. And in fact, there's a lot more research that goes into choosing cider varieties. What we have really seen is that the last couple of years, if it is a very traditional cider tree, that there's a lot of demand for it. And you may find that you're not going to find the right variety or the one that you're really looking for. However, as you can see with this common recommendations, many of the traditional kind of older heirloom apples are great for cider and can work really well for hard cider. These are things like McIntosh, Freedom, Arkansas Black. One of the newer ones that we do recommend at U of I is Crimson Crisp. So it could provide you cider as well as maybe a fresh eating apple. And then one that comes highly recommended is Gold Rush. Gold Rush is a newer performing apple, and it's just highly recommended for those that make cider, as well as just performs really well in the backyard. So moving now into a bit more about disease resistance. This is one of the things that you need to choose when it comes to growing your apples. It's something that really helps you control disease, and it can help you understand if it's going to be a problem this season or it's not going to be a problem whatsoever. Sometimes this can also help you reduce your spray schedule. Some diseases still need to be treated on the tree, even though you know it has some resistance. Most of the time, most apple varieties are going to have some form of resistance. And the main diseases we're trying to think about are scab, fire blight, and maybe a couple of other ones that we want to make sure that we have a resistance for. This chart from Purdue, I've blown up on this slide. So you can see that you'll get a handout of this resource from Purdue, and it kind of gives you the apple cultivar on the left, and then on the top are the different diseases that are pretty common and pretty concerned with, especially apple scab and fire blight, both of which I'll show you photos of. But you can see, if I'm going to grow, say, Fuji in the backyard, it is susceptible to apple scab, and it is very susceptible to fire blight. Compare that to maybe if I'm going to go grow Gold Rush, it's very resistant to apple scab, and maybe it has some moderate resistance to fire blight. So it could have some issue with the disease off and on, depending on the season, but it has some moderate resistance. We want to try to encourage as much resistance as we can when it comes to dealing with these diseases. And the way that sometimes you're getting resistance is actually through your rootstock, which we'll talk about today. So it is that the company you're ordering from has put that Fuji apple on a rootstock that has disease resistance to apple scab and fire blight. So that's how you're getting that resistance on it. For pears, the main disease concern is fire blight. And you see it in this photo from Utah State, this kind of torched appearance, if you will, on the tree. And it's one that over time could potentially kill the tree. So that's why we're really concerned with fire blight, especially on pears, and why we've seen a lot of folks actually remove some of their pear trees over the last couple of years. As mentioned, the Bartlett is highly susceptible to fire blight. You may find that there are disease-resistant Bartlett pears out there on a particular rootstock, but for the most of the time, it still is one that's very, very susceptible to fire blight. There are other ones that are moderately susceptible. You see there Maxine, Danjou, 20th century. They could have some fire blight, but they can be okay, if you will, compared to some of the very highly susceptible ones. And then there are resistant varieties, Kiefer, Moonglow ones listed there. There are other ones too that have some resistance. These are just kind of mentioned as ones to look at. So the rootstock is a decision that you may or may not have to make. A lot of times when you're ordering from a company like Jung or Stark Brothers, they have already given, they're not giving you that choice. They've already put that variety onto a particular rootstock. And this rootstock is giving you some disease resistance. And this rootstock is also giving you potentially some winter hardiness, the ability to really survive the winters. And above this rootstock union is the variety that you're wanting to grow. But below that rootstock union is where potentially the disease resistance is and where the winter hardiness is. And you can see in this photo that I took, I'm pointing towards where this graft union is. And it's very important that this graft union is always above the soil line, because if it is actually buried into the soil or it's touching the soil, there's a risk that that rootstock can take over, which is not really what you're wanting whatsoever. But yes, you may be given a choice or you may not be given a choice whatsoever when it comes to your rootstock. It depends highly on what the company has. And in most cases, when you're reaching out to a nursery or an online seller, you're giving your zip code and they're matching up to make sure that you're getting the right rootstock. This rootstock is also providing that height. So it's providing that dwarf, semi-dwarf with the rootstock that's being chosen, along with that disease resistance and that winter hardiness. The most common tend to be M7, M9, Bud9, M26. There is also one that's a very EMLA27 is good for containers and only reaches about 4 to 6 feet in height. But certainly, you know, depending on who you order your trees from, you may have a decision on this or you may not. But know full well that the rootstock is pretty important when it comes to having disease resistance and growing that tree really well. One of the other things that you're going to consider when it comes to apples and pears is that you need more than one cultivar. Apples, pears, sweet cherries are all what we call self-unfruitful. So they're going to be pollinated by the pollinators. And you'll note here that next week we'll talk about stone fruit like cherry and peach, but sweet cherries are ones that we typically do not recommend in Northern Illinois because you need more than one variety of sweet cherries, and you need both of them to survive our winters. And frankly, it's just really hard sometimes for sweet cherries and other stone fruit to survive the cold winters that we have. The buds just don't survive it. So for apples and pears, it means then that they cannot pollinate themselves. So if you put out a row of, say, 6 or 7 Honeycrisp trees, they would not produce for you. You need to have another variety in there that is flowering or rather blooming at the same time in order for the pollinators to move among those different varieties. It's very common for us at our extension office to receive a phone call, maybe every couple of years where someone has fruit trees in the backyard and the apples have never yielded for them and they don't know why that is. And one of the main things that we find out is that the only fruit tree they have is potentially just the Honeycrisps, or it is just Jonathan. You need more than one variety and you need the blooming at the same time. You also need to think about how far of a distance these trees are. Really, you're looking at kind of a 50-foot kind of radius among your trees. So certainly, depending on how far they were in the backyard, you could space them out, but you still want to make sure you're within that 50-foot kind of radius from tree to tree. There's also what I kind of call the selfish pollinizers. So Jonagold, Gravenstein, and Winesap. There's a couple of other ones out there. What I mean by this is that Jonagold will maybe take the pollen from the Honeycrisp, but it will not return the favor. So it's going to be very selfish. It's going to use Honeycrisp for its own pollination needs, but it's not going to provide Honeycrisp perhaps with its own pollination needs, is what I mean there. So it's going to be a little selfish, if you will. And what you encounter here is that if you want to grow Winesap, you now need potentially 2 additional varieties. So it could be you grow Winesap, you grow Fuji, and you grow Honeycrisp, knowing full well that Winesap will have its pollination needs met, but it's not going to provide any pollen to the other 2 varieties. Your crab apples could also act as the pollinator. So if you already had established crab apples at your home or your backyard, you could potentially get away with just putting out one tree and one variety of that tree because the crab apples are acting as the pollinator. I've listed a number of these that have been recommended for Northern Illinois and can grow really well for you. Now, keep in mind that a lot of times crab apple trees will also have very similar disease problems as your apples and your pear trees as well. And crab apples would only act as the apple pollinator in this situation. They wouldn't help with your pear pollination. If you have poor pollination on your current trees, so say they're not yielding for you consistently, it maybe you have mismatched varieties. Perhaps you have varieties that are not blooming at the same time. You might also find that you need to do a pollinator strip. So maybe put out some additional plants, maybe they're annual flowers or others, and see if that could provide more pollination and pollinators to arrive for you. You might also even encounter that they're just too far from each other. They could just be too far of a distance from you for them to really, really work here. But that's going to be something to consider if you're planting new fruit trees of apples this season, is that you're going to have more than one variety flowering at the same time. I will send you this handout as well. This is a chart that was developed by, I think it was Washington State. And so you can see on the left here, the variety pollinated, and then at the top you see pollen provided. And what this means is that if I decide that I'm going to grow Fuji perhaps, or rather if I'm going to plant Empire, any place where there's an X would be a good compatible variety. It would be a fine match, so it means that, okay, if I plant Empire, I could plant Braeburn, Cortland, Fuji, Gala, Jonathan, and any others where there's an X marks, and they could provide me as cross-pollination. If I had space for just two fruit trees, I could grow Empire and then I could grow Cortland, knowing full well that both of them are going to give the pollen for each other and produce those apples that we're after. In most cases, if you're reaching out to nurseries, they're going to be mindful of this. They're going to want you to buy more than one apple tree, and they're going to tell you which ones are the right match for that tree. They're very good about this because they want you to buy another tree, and they also want you to be successful. I kind of zeroed in here a little bit more so you can kind of see what I was just kind of explaining. So if I'm going to grow Empire, anything with an X is going to be the fruit tree that I'm going to plant. And you, of course, could also put out additional ones, not just particularly just one and one other. You could put out a mixture of them. What we find is that a lot of times there are groups of fruit trees that are all blooming at the same time. So you'll find many different varieties all blooming in the same period of time to address this. I think what you encounter sometimes is that you have a very early yielding variety and you have a late yielding variety. And so as you saw back to my recommendation of cultivars, you saw that there were kind of early yielding ones and you saw that there were kind of late fall yielding ones. And you may find that if you were just growing an early one and you're growing a late one, that those two maybe are not flowering at the same time. That's sometimes where we have an issue. The other issue, of course, being that you've only grown one cultivar and it's not going to produce any fruit because of that. Pears is a similar situation. For pears, more than one is really needed. There are those such as Anjou, Kiefer, and Bartlett that we classify as partial. They could still produce pears for you, but they're not going to produce as much and they're not going to be consistent if you did not plant more than one variety. So we would still recommend you planting more than one pear variety, just because you're not going to have consistent yields and you're not going to have as many yields if you just did the partial ones. There's some examples here you see for Anjou, of course, you might plant a Bartlett or you might plant the Bear Blanc. For Bartlett, you could do Starking Delight or Moonglow. For Seckel, Moonglow or Starking Delight. So there's many different ones that you could plant together, but just recognize that we still would recommend more than one cultivar for pear production too. You might get away with it, but we would still recommend more than one. One of the other decisions that you encounter is a little bit more tied to, yet again, you may or may not have a choice here. Sometimes when you're ordering from a company, ordering from a group, they will say that they have a whip or bare root, or there's a feathered option. The whip or the bare root tends to be that there's no extra limbs. You order it, it arrives to your home, and there's no limbs on it whatsoever. It looks like a twig. It looks like you have just ordered a twig, and yet that is your fruit tree. May be delayed typically by a year because of that. And they call this as bare root. You might also see it as whip as well. And you may not have much of a choice here. Sometimes companies will just have the whip bare root one. The feathered one is the one you see in this photo. This is a peach tree, but it is yet again a feathered tree. So you can see that when I ordered it, you can see lots of limbs. There are buds that are on it already, and it tends to mature a year earlier, and it also tends to need a little bit less training than required usually. So this would be your additional decision. Another thing to consider is that sometimes a feathered tree is more expensive. And the reason for that is, yet again, you're getting a year ahead. You already have some limbs that are being produced off the main trunk of that tree. You may not be given much of a choice here. You may find that the place you're ordering from just specializes in whip bare root trees, or you may find that they have feathered trees. I think if I was thinking, we'll talk about this at the end of the day, but if I was thinking of planting my pears or my apple trees, I wouldn't necessarily worry that I couldn't get it as a whip bare root or as a feathered. I'd be more concerned that that variety that I'm planting has disease resistance, and that perhaps I'm doing a dwarf, semi-dwarf tree. Those would be the main two criterias that I would kind of focus in on. And then, yes, if I got the option to choose, maybe I might lean heavier on the feathered one. As I teach fruit tree pruning classes and other fruit classes too, I do know that we have a lot of folks that have established trees. I certainly recognize that a lot of folks have really old trees and they're growing really well for them, and maybe they just need a little bit of attention sometimes. We see this a lot in Daviess County, especially. As you're thinking about replacing, or maybe the better word is removing, or just kind of putting in a different tree to replace that older one, the thing that you might consider is that the tree is just too tall to harvest from. Perhaps the fruit is higher up in the tree. It's really hard to get to. Perhaps it needs more pruning than you need done, and you just can't get to around to that tree. It may need more attention than you're just really able to. Perhaps the tree has physical damage to the tree, especially during the summer storms that we sometimes encounter, where the tree has lost substantial parts of its limb, parts of the trunk have been severely damaged. Maybe that's what you've encountered with some of your trees. A lot of times too, disease vulnerability. It might be a tree that's 40, 50 years old, and yet, it's just getting hit hard every single year with disease, and it's very hard to control it because there are so many limbs and the tree is very tall at this point. And the other thing you might look at is maybe there's a dwarf or semi-dwarf option. My family still has a lot of a family farm in Tennessee, and we have close to 65 apple trees in this family farm. And a lot of our trees are standard trees that are huge, and we love the fruit off of them. And yet we could potentially get them as a dwarf, semi-dwarf option. We don't need to keep maybe necessarily taking care of a tree that is really hard to take care of when the dwarf, semi-dwarf option is available. This is one of the trees from Gail in our extension office in Daviess County. She always speaks very highly of this tree, and it grows really well for her. And yet, as you can see, it's a lot of pruning that has to be done. And some years are really good for the fruit, some years aren't as good. And, it would be something where maybe she could, plant a new one that might replace that tree, but kind of leaving the tree as is, if you will. So thinking about more, still thinking about maybe planting fruit trees and considering kind of what things to think about, we still would recommend a couple of things for soil needs. We still would recommend calling Julie. Julie is a service through the electrical company, as well as a couple of other industries or rather electric and gas and other ones. And when you call them, it's a free service. You're letting them know that you're planning to dig on your property, and they will come out and they will flag where the different power lines are and so forth are. I had this done this past spring. They came out, they flagged different areas where the power lines were, and I knew full well not to dig in those areas. It's just something, depending on your location, depending on where you're at, that you want to be mindful of when it comes to digging. We still would also recommend getting a soil test, and this soil test is something that could be performed probably in the next, I would say, maybe a month or two before you plan to plant, especially if you just didn't know what was going on in that soil. I still say you could probably get away without one because our fertile soil is so fertile, and yet kind of be mindful of that. Consider full sunlight. These trees need full sunlight. They're not going to do well in shade. You want to think about good weed control. So these trees should not go in an area that's heavily out of control when it comes to weeds. Consider areas of your property where there are frost pockets. So you want to have good airflow. You don't want to have any dips in your yard where it could potentially stay too cold. That's really what we're really thinking about. Soil pH about 6 to 7, so pretty standard. A little bit of acidity, all the way up to neutral is kind of what you see here too. And especially maybe the first season, consider having that water supply nearby. You will find that as these roots start to take off, and depending on how our summer is, you may want to make sure that they're staying pretty consistent in moisture with their needs. We'll talk about pruning coming up, but as far as any kind of day one tasks, this would be a great time to think about mammal control. You know, that is one area where this group just loves, these mammals especially love these trees. And it's very important to have weed-free area around the tree because that can keep mammals, very smaller mammals, from getting to these trees. But also consider a deer guard. And a deer guard you kind of see as it will be a bit of more of a plastic piece that basically protects the trunk of these very young trees. You might also consider soap around the neck. We'll talk a little bit more about that going forward, as the soap can act as a deterrent to mammals. And if you are growing dwarf, semi-dwarf trees, they're going to require staking their entire life. So keep that in mind, that those two, the dwarf and the semi-dwarf trees, will almost always need staking their entire life, especially dwarf trees. You see in this photo, this is one of my peach trees I planted. It already has the bamboo stake ready to go. I was waiting for some ties to have support for this piece. Bamboo, wood, metal, others can work. You want it to be pretty loose. You're just kind of wanting it to provide some support for these trees going on. But certainly that's going to be one thing that they will really need their entire life, is staking, if it's dwarf, semi-dwarf. Pruning and training can also be done on day one. So you see in this photo, if I was to buy a whipped tree, a tree that has nothing on it, so there's nothing whatsoever growing off of it, by June and July, I might do a little bit of training where I'm trying to kind of bend these limbs down with clothespins or even with elastic, kind of against that trunk. You're trying to get these branches to stay as horizontal as you can, especially in that first year. You see on the opposite side a feathered tree. So if I purchase a feathered tree, I could do a heading cut at planting. And that heading cut is just to kind of signal to the tree to start producing more branches. And that's really kind of what you're after with that heading cut there. You see as well, elastic could be used to kind of bend those branches down. You also note that the feathered tree at planting may have broken branches as it arrived, so you would want to prune those branches out too. So for pruning basics, it's really important to think about knowing that tree. The dwarf, the semi-dwarf, those are all going to be pruned slightly different. You will find that a standard tree has a lot of places where you need to be able to prune, and yet the dwarf, semi-dwarf approach, you may not need as much. A lot of times with apples and pears, we talk about a central leader style. And think of this as like a Christmas tree. We think about how a Christmas tree shapes are, where the lower branches of that tree are very horizontal and they're the furthest ones out. And as you go up the top of that tree and make your way up, the branches get shorter and shorter. And yet that style allows for good airflow, and it allows for sunlight to get to the leaves of all branches of your tree. You could also do espalier on the apples and pears, which is what you see here, where it's almost like you're doing a bit of a grape vine trellising with it. Every year we get questions when to prune. Mid-December to March 1st is what we have in Northern Illinois and what I tend to recommend. You could maybe some years go beyond March 1st, and yet sometimes the fruit trees for apples and pears, they want to quickly grow to the next growth stage. And sometimes you can't get away with that. So I tend to say about March 1st is where I would probably stop. How much to prune? We look to see about 30 to 40% of limbs per season. So as you look at the tree that you have, and we'll talk more about, you're only going to collectively get 30 to 40% off of that tree every year. One big question, do I seal the cuts? No, we do not recommend sealing the cuts. And you see this about every place that has pruning equipment, is this pruning seal. And yet the pruning seal has the ability to lock in moisture and could actually kill the tree that you're trying to get into shape. So we do not recommend it. If you were able to prune during the right time period between mid-December and March 1st, the wounds of those cuts would seal up properly. There's another thing here called dormant oil. It addresses smaller insects. So it is like a spray, and it goes towards aphids, scales, and others. And this is one where you're applying it when the temperatures are 30s and the 40s. That's something that you could do that, could control some of those very small insects. If you don't have any time, kind of limited time where you're realizing, okay, it's the last week of February, Grant has told me I only have a week to prune, try to do water sprouts, very small suckers. Those could be easily ones that can grow, can be removed quickly. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So pruning goals, we're always thinking about getting those scaffold branches closer to the harvest level. Those scaffold branches are those horizontal limbs off of my tree. And off of those horizontal limbs are where we're going to find our fruit. We want to think about pruning out wood that interferes with tree productivity. And we want to think about achieving a shape and a height that really works for you. And I always encourage folks to think about keeping disease from spreading. That's one time where you might be moving fire blight among your different trees without realizing it. If it is a tree that hasn't been pruned in, say, 4 to 5 years, you should expect that it might take you 3 additional years to get that tree into some kind of shape. It can take some time. Don't expect that you are pruning in 2021 and you don't have to prune again until 2025. You really are going to have to get into the habit of pruning every year. So you're making this decision of growing fruit trees, and you have to accept that you're going to have to prune. This gives you an idea of some of the tools that we might recommend when it comes to pruning. You see kind of those loppers, and the loppers have the ability to actually get longer, which works really well for some of the limbs that you're after. You see smaller hand saws that can get to some of those limbs, kind of in nooks and crannies. I still find that really tiny hand pruners are ones that I use quite often for smaller ones. And then kind of that bandsaw there. Bandsaw can allow for some good cuts that you're after. You also note I have a bottle of alcohol there, rubbing alcohol. The reason for this is that we're trying to keep disease from spreading. And sometimes the best way to do this during the wintertime is to try to dip your equipment and the saws into this alcohol solution as you're moving from tree to tree if you have a lot. It's laborious. I certainly understand it because I have to do this as well. And if you have kind of a bucket, you can pour alcohol in and kind of dip your tools in it. This can be very beneficial to keep disease from spreading, especially if you've got a pear tree and especially if that tree is prone for fire blight. You might find that a chainsaw is needed for a couple of limbs. There are also very smaller chainsaw-like pruners on the market. I've seen a couple of them. They're a little expensive, and yet they can sometimes work really well for some of the limbs that you're after. Where to make that cut then? So if we're thinking of a very long limb, a very long horizontal limb, you want to find where the actual fruit buds are. And this is what you see here on the left. So within that photo on the left, On the actual left, you see that kind of leaf bud. So that is not going to be producing your fruit. But in the right, that little kind of stub is where your fruit buds are. And we call these spurs. And the spurs is what's going to be producing your fruit. So if you follow me then over to the right side of this of the screen, you see kind of my drawing here of the 0.5 inch. And that's where you're doing your cut. You're finding where the bud is that you're decided that this limb is too long, and you're following that limb all the way back, and you're going about a 1/2 inch forward from that bud, and you're cutting in a slant. And the reason for the slant is that it tends to heal up a little bit better than if it is more of a straight cut down that limb. The bottom photo of my drawing, you see that I have kind of decided to cut that limb. The reason for that is that as you're thinking, okay, where I might make the cut, it might be that you're just cutting right to where the limbs start to go different directions that you don't want. So it could be growing up vertically, could be growing downward, it could be growing in different things that you're just not after. And like I shared with you, this is a very, very short introduction to pruning. We have longer ones, longer sessions coming up on this. So when we talk about central leader tree structure, we're thinking about one central leader. So one leader branch in the green, and then off of these central leader branches, you're going to have scaffolds in blue. And that's what you see in this drawing. Off of the scaffold branches, those are what is going to be producing your actual fruit. The suckers are in yellow, water sprouts are in red, purple. I think if you're looking at your established fruit trees right now, you probably see a lot of places where it's a lot of suckers and a lot of water sprouts that could easily come off that tree. And they're really not serving you much good. They're growing vertically off of the scaffolds, and they're not going to be producing much fruit. And yet you're going to find a lot of them. And that will kind of get you to that 30 to 40%. You might also have secondary scaffolds in red. You might have replacement scaffolds in red. Occasionally you have branches that are too close to the tree. Sometimes you have kind of a crotch O angle of a 45 to 60 degrees of what you're after. And yet maybe that scaffold branch is growing vertically, just not what you're after. But that's kind of the structure you're after, is kind of the central leader branch and then your scaffolds off of it. So one of the things, if you're just getting started with pruning, try to find a leader. Try to look for a leader in there in your green. And then from there, focus on getting out dead wood, looking for water sprouts, any branches that are growing vertical, downward, inward into the tree, anytime you're having crosses on the tree. Sometimes I also start to look for replacements. So maybe there's a scaffold branch in the blue that you just don't like. And so below that, you might decide to actually see if there's a very, very tiny water sprout that could be a replacement over time. Especially if it's a tree that hasn't been pruned for years, there's always a big cut. Sometimes finding that big cut can really help you get that tree back in shape. Finding the big cut of sometimes many big cuts can be sometimes what you encounter. So sometimes when I'm pruning our family trees, we have a tree that has 4 to 5 different big cuts. And knowing full well that I can't take out every single one of them in one season, I now have them kind of classified for the years to come. So this one comes out in 2021, this one comes out in 2022, this one comes out in 2023. And then I see how the tree has shaped, how it's been modified with that weight loss, and see if my plans change. So a couple of examples. These are all photos of some of my family's fruit trees. You can see a lot of dead wood over here. You put your hands on it, the bark just starts to fall apart. On the opposite side, this is a tree where just everything is there. You've got limbs that are crossing, limbs that are growing vertically that aren't serving me much purpose. I've got limbs growing downward, limbs growing inward into the tree. It's just a very hard place to start for some of these if they haven't been pruned properly, or haven't been pruned in a lot of years, which frankly is some of my family's trees. You see a lot of suckers in this photo here. A lot of them are just coming straight from the bottom of the tree. And this is an apple tree. It doesn't look like it, and yet the suckers are ones that can easily come out of that tree. You may find you have competing leaders. This is one of our trees here that's a competing leader. And yet because of the age of the tree and because of the shape of the tree, I'm not thinking of removing one of these leaders. Sometimes if you're growing a dwarf or a semi-dwarf tree, you might be able to get away with removing one of the leaders. And yet sometimes if the tree is very old, 20, 25 years old, it may be very hard to remove one of these. And you just have to kind of accept that this is the shape of your tree and really hope that the tree is going to keep performing as best it can for you. So one of the ways that I teach pruning classes, if you're still on the fence, not sure you want to join me, is to do some coloring. So I will take photos and I will use Microsoft Paint and I will actually color the trees based on what we're looking for. So you can see in this photo of one of my fruit trees, I'm trying to find that central leader or what I think is the central leader. And then from there, maybe see where the scaffolds might be. And this can just give you a better idea of where to start, because I think that can be a very intimidating process of not knowing where to start, because sometimes there's so much to deal with and start with. And I know, of course, if this is just 2D, if I was to go around the other side of the tree, I might see something that's much different, or I might see something I wasn't necessarily expecting. But this coloring system, I find, can really help me think more about how I need to prune trees, what shape I'm after, and kind of where I might need to go from there. And you can see that, I certainly have a lot of red, of vertical limbs, of suckers, of many things that can go out, but I can also start to maybe see some scaffolds that maybe need to be replaced over time. Certainly you can kind of see in this photo, the ones on the left, where I've got a bit of a scaffold branch that is, we hope, producing fruit, and yet it's almost growing fully vertical. And it may be one that I replace with one of the red branches. This is a tree that was pruned 2 years ago. So this is the orchard, my family's orchard in Tennessee. And so it had been pruned. And so you can see that, we still kind of have maybe a big cut here or there. I've got almost a competing leader on that right side there in the green. And it's one that is still such a huge part of that tree. If I was to take out that one limb on the right in the green, you're looking at almost 40% perhaps. So it is a limb that I probably do want to remove, and yet I think over time I'm going to maybe cut back from it. You'll also note that I've circled in black on the left there some potential suckers, water sprouts that could be replacement limbs. So it is those that could become a scaffold branch over time that can maybe be evened out. So because I did a lot of pruning the previous season on this tree, the increase in the amount of red that you see here has now given me new options to potentially replace some of those branches I'm just not too pleased with. But yes, that's just a very quick little overview of pruning. We have more pruning classes coming up in the next couple of weeks. So into now diseases and insects. These are going to be some of the ones that we commonly see and some of the ones that you want to try to have disease resistance if you can, or do some good practices in place. You might also try to do some fungicides or some spray program, but I want to also mention things that you could do during that season to maybe help control disease or keep insects from being a problem. This is one we see every year as apple scab. You can see that it has this appearance on the actual fruit of the apples as it's developing. So we see it every single season. Sometimes it's more severe based on having a wet spring. And the reason that we see it is that the leaves that fall underneath your apple in the previous autumn and the fall will then overwinter into the next spring. And when we have very wet conditions, the spores of the fungus will then move from the dead decaying leaves under your tree up into the actual tree. And so that's the cycle of apple scab. And so really the best practice you could do is try to remove the fallen leaves. If you didn't have this done this past fall, I would try to do this, in the next couple of months, maybe in March, if there's no longer snow on the ground, try to remove some of these leaves away from your tree. And try to also think about pruning for good airflow. Even giving some pruning can really help kind of dry those leaves out into the spring and into the summer. There's a lot of varieties that have resistance. I think you're going to find many will have some kind of apple scab resistance. And it can be pretty severe some years if you've got a variety that's very prone to apple scab disease. So fire blight we've talked a little bit about today so far. Look for resistant varieties. So apple scab and fire blight resistance on your apple trees is very good decisions to make. You also want to think about disinfecting pruners. So if you have a variety of that you're growing that is very prone to disease resist, or rather prone to fire blight, try to disinfect them with some rubbing alcohol solution. You also want to consider avoid using high rates of nitrogen fertilizer. You heard me today not really talk a lot about nutrients for your apples and pears. And the reason for that is that our soils are pretty fertile. We really don't see a lot of people actually supplementing with any kind of fertility for this group. But certainly it would, that high fertility rate for nitrogen would then see a lot more growth on your tree, which is really what we don't want for a fire blight prone tree. This is one that if it shows up in the summer, you actually want to prune. We usually don't recommend pruning, and yet if this shows up, you actually want to prune. And you will see this kind of blackish infection like you see here on this cherry tree, and you would find a certain place where it kind of levels off, in fact. So you would actually see that there's a bit of a blackish line where the infection has stopped on the limb. And from that line, you want to go about 6 to 12 inches below, and you actually want to prune out this mixture of healthy tissue and infected tissue. But yes, just this is the one that we hear folks that lose trees season after season because of fire blight, and you want to be cautious of. Cedar apple rust is the other big three of diseases for our apples and the pears. Try to find resistant varieties. This is one that is fairly cosmetic, so it is something that, yes, it looks really rough that season. Your fruit might look a little bit rough too, and yet it's pretty cosmetic, and it's something I wouldn't worry always too much about, depending on what your expectation for fruit is. You want to try to remove all the galls from the juniper or the red cedar. That's really what is causing this infection, is these kind of gelatinous, orangish kind of galls that are on the tree of the juniper or the red cedar. So if you have these on your property, you might expect them to be on there, these masses that have the disease. The issue though is it's just not one on the tree. Sometimes it's close to 50 or 60 of them covering the trees. The other issue is we might say, okay, if you want to get growing and want to put a lot of fruit trees on apples and pears, remove all the cedars. Well, it has to be 4 to 5 miles from your orchard. That's a lot of knocking on doors, asking folks to remove their cedar trees for your own benefit. So we really don't recommend that, of course. But yes, fairly cosmetic in most years. I would focus more on fire blight and scab resistance if you can. For your insects then, apple maggot, it's going to overwinter its pupa in the soil. You can see a photo of what this damage looks like. And I'd say probably some of you have had this before. It looks kind of like pimples on your apple. When you actually cut into the apple flesh, you might see some additional infection like you see here in that photo. The best practice for this one tends to be picking up any falling apples. So any apples that have fallen on the ground can be picked up and discarded. I don't think I would put them in a compost bin. I would probably actually try to throw them away if you can, just because as they're being composted, they would still probably increase in population. There is a red sticky spear trap, which you see in the photo there. And this looks like a red delicious colored apple, and it works really well. A lot of folks will actually use this to trap the apple maggot. And it's this tanglefoot product, a very sticky residue that you put onto the red sticky spear. You hang it up by July 1st. You need one of these per 100 apples. So you may find that you need more than one on your tree, depending on how tall your tree is and how much fruit you expect. Folks will also say they've had good luck taking a piece of wood, spray painting it that red delicious color, and then hanging it up with that kind of tanglefoot product. The tanglefoot is a bit of like a glue, but it's not as, it really just focuses a lot on the apple maggots. There are insecticides available. They have to be a time before the flies lay their eggs though. Codling moth tends to emerge just before bloom, so you can see a very different appearance on the apples than the apple maggots have done, and yet you still may see both of them this season. This is one where sanitation is really crucial, but the issue is that adults can fly as far as a mile. So the main sanitation recommendation would be pick up, remove fallen apples, and hopefully that could address apple maggot, and that could also address your codling moth. There are traps, but when I say traps here, we're talking about trapping the male codling moth, and then that's determining whether you need to spray something. You compare that to the apple maggot trap that actually traps them. This is more trapping the males and letting you know that you've got them and you need to do something about them. For both maggot as well as codling moth, some folks will also wrap their apples in plastic, little plastic containers, not containers rather, but plastic bags. You sometimes see those on the market. You sometimes also see little fabric bags on the market too, where folks will take those and kind of put fabric bag around the apples as it's developing. So that could be an option to kind of create that barrier to keep them from going. Of course, that would be laborious. It might also be pretty expensive too. Our final kind of one is plum curculia. So it's a weevil, it lays eggs into apples, plums, cherries, just lots of other fruits. There is some good management you could do. You kind of physically remove it and you kind of shake the tree limbs with a tarp underneath. This tends to happen kind of in the May, June is where you might do this. It sounds strange, and yet there are folks that have done this before and recommend kind of shaking the tree for the plum curculia females to drop. You can see the damage on the apple here, a little bit different than the maggot as well as the codling moth. Certainly, like the other two, pick up and destroy early drops in May and June. There are insecticides available as well. In our area, frost damage is another thing you've got to consider. This is something, of course, that's a little bit out of your control, and it will always depend highly on the growth stage of the apple and the pear, where your trees are located, and a lot of other environmental factors. Apples and pears do not tend to be heavily impacted, say, by very cold January and February temperatures. They tend to be more impacted by our late April, early May conditions. If we have a late frost that is reaching into the 20s, and depending on the growth stage of your apples and the pears, this is where we see damage. And so you can see these temperature cutoffs, if you will. So at about 28 degrees Fahrenheit, if your apples are, say, in the bloom period, kind of like what you see here in this photo, potentially you could have 10% loss of fruit. If we reach 24 degrees Fahrenheit for a period of time, potentially 90% loss of fruit based on the growth stage of where your fruits are at. And many of them are in this bloom period. They're getting very close to that bloom period into those May periods. This might be okay. One of the things to consider is that a lot of times we have way more fruit on our trees than we need. And we really just need that king fruit. And the king fruit is the flower that you see here, the main one that will produce the biggest fruit for you. And sometimes if it's killing off some of the buds, it's actually helping you to thin out that tree because those would have probably dropped in June or July. However, just kind of keep that in mind that this one has that risk depending greatly on the growth stage. And as I tell folks, every backyard is a little bit different. Wildlife damage is also going to be apparent for some of these fruit trees. This is some wildlife damage that I had on my peach tree this October, where a deer came in and pruned the tree for me. Tried to use a deer guard, kind of a whitish plastic barrier in place. Look to also remove any mulch around the base of the tree, keeping it very bare soil is really what you're after, because that mulch can really allow for protection for rabbits and other smaller critters to be around the base of the tree, and they can cause damage and chew on those vulnerable roots. Look to also Irish spring, hang a rope of Irish spring around the tree, can act as a deterrent from the deer. And then also you could potentially do hot pepper spray. Hot pepper spray is this kind of bottle that you sometimes see at nurseries, a spray bottle of it. And you can go onto the leaves of the tree, and it tends to kind of not be something that they really like. It's just not pleasant to them. The only issue I've encountered when using hot pepper spray is, as you can imagine, when it rains, it washes off. The other thing is that some of the hot pepper sprays are just labeled for ornamentals. They're not actually labeled for edible crops. And while I don't expect you to be eating the leaves of your apple and pear trees, I still think you've got to be very mindful that it's not labeled for edible crops. So seek out ones that are labeled for edible crops. One of the things I want to mention some is that you will find guides that are for spraying insecticides and fungicides to address some of your insects and diseases that you encounter. And it may very much be necessary depending on your fruit expectations. That's really what we do see. And this is for organic, this is for conventional. It depends a lot highly on your tree, the severity of symptoms, and of course the fruit stage when it comes to whether you decide to implement a spray program or whether you do other things instead. We still recommend to spray early in the evening with less pollinator activity, even after all of your fruits are pollinated. You'll find that a lot of times the fungicides, insecticides available to you will also tell you certain growth stages in which you cannot apply that product. So it's something to kind of be aware of, I think, sometimes, is that there are sprays available to you for homeowner use. Some of these can work pretty well for addressing them, but some may not do much good. If you already have a lot of fire blight in the orchard, a fungicide is not going to do you much good compared to if you started spraying early in the season before those symptoms showed up. And yet again, there's other factors you have to consider when it comes to utilizing it. A lot of these are good practices. These are a lot of things we've already talked about today, but when it comes to addressing insects, disease, certainly fungicides, insecticides can be used at certain time periods of growth, but we also would still recommend utilizing these things, making sure you have disease-resistant cultivars, or you're growing a tree that has fire blight, so you want to think about how you prune so that you're not spreading disease. Perhaps you're using apple maggot traps to trap the apple maggots to keep them from being much of a problem. Or you put out lures for some of the codling moths to keep them away. You're cleaning up the orchard. You're sending out children and grandchildren to pick up the gross apples from underneath the tree during the season. You're raking the leaves away from the apple trees every year to make sure that the apple scab does not move in. You're pruning every year. Pruning can do great when it comes to controlling disease because it allows for good airflow and allows for those leaves to dry out. Perhaps you're even thinning out the fruits. You may be shaking them or removing parts of them by hand and leaving some of the other fruits behind. But you're doing these practices to keep disease and to potentially keep insects from being too much of a problem. So a spray program will be kind of as prevention or apply before a bloom period. So typically you're going to see that a lot of this was probably going to be happening in April, if you will, when it comes to it. Some spray guides will say that, if your buds have entered this next phase of growth, then you could spray this. Or if they've entered this phase of growth, then you cannot spray it. You're done for the season. So you may find it's just not worth the effort, depending on severity and really the tree height. As you think about a standard tree and you're trying to control fire blight or some other disease that it gets every year, it may be very hard to spray high up into that tree because of the height and may just not work. And after this kind of bloom period has occurred, really the cultural practices would be what we would recommend. It would be the traps, it would be cleaning orchard floor, it would be thinning out the fruit. But as we know, every season can be a bit different. So just kind of keeping in mind that there are some available to you, but a lot of times the spray schedules have to very much be followed, that you go from dormancy into the next stage, into the next stage. And what we really encounter in Northern Illinois is that you can go quickly from one growth stage to the next, sometimes in the matter of 2 weeks. And so while you were great to address one disease 3 weeks ago, you now have moved to a different growth stage of your blooms and of your flowers that you cannot apply it. So hopefully we've still convinced you to plant fruit trees. I know that's one thing I run into is that it's like, grow the fruit trees, but here's all the disease problems, here's the insect problems, here are all these decisions you have to make. Or if you currently have trees, you know that these are all the things you have to do. But we hope that you get the harvest. That's what we always hope for in U of I Extension, is you finally get to enjoy the fruits of your labor. For apples, you're going to find that these are going to be harvested during a certain month, or sometimes even a week by week. Sometimes we find that these mature pretty quickly, depending on that growing season. What I would recommend for a small scale orchard, taste test. Taste the fruit, see if it's giving you that flavor that you're really expecting and what you're really after. If you cut into that tree, or rather the actual apple, look to see that seed. Is the seed a very good, strong, solid brown color? Those are going to be the two things to really help you, along with knowing when it would be harvested. For a European pear, it should ripen off the tree. So I should be able to grab the pear. It should snap off cleanly off the branch when at a 90-degree angle. The spots, kind of those lenticels is what they're called, they'll go from white to brown. It should have a waxy feel. It should also feel a little bit like a softball. So there should be a little bit of a give with it. You will also find that that pear should have gone from a deep green to a light green before you then take it off of the tree and you let it ripen for usually about 7 to 10 days before use. Asian pears will ripen on the vine. So they'll ripen on the tree. The skin color will change. It will go from more of a green to a yellowish green, and it will ripen fully on that tree. One of the other suggestions I have when it comes to determining when to harvest your fruit is to actually see when orchards in your area are harvesting. Most of them will produce a harvest calendar, usually in August. And this can give you an idea of when your fruit could be harvested from you. So if you know of an orchard maybe in your area, in your county, maybe even down the road, you might see what their harvest calendar is. Because if you're growing Johnamac, you might then see when they're expecting to pick their Johnamac. And you might see, okay, they're planning September 7th. Maybe hopefully my Johnamac is ready to be harvested by then too. And that can give you some context as to it. Every year is a little bit different, of course, and their calendar is always different every year. But sometimes these orchards, of course, know when things will be harvested. And that gives you a great idea of when to pick. This image here gives you a greater understanding of the different types of apples available to you and how you might have a season-long harvest. Knowing full well that, okay, I'm growing ginger gold, that's going to be harvested in August, but I'm not going to harvest my pink ladies until the end of October. So that can give some context there of, okay, you've done the taste test, you've looked at the seeds, and then the orchard in your area is harvesting similar varieties around this time. Some of their apples will do really well with storage. Temperature and humidity are going to be the main factors. We typically see 30 to 32 degrees Fahrenheit and a humidity of 90 to 95% as the best for cold storage of the fruit. And apples, of course, can be picked, ripened, and stored this way. You might also want to make sure that the smaller ones, more than the larger fruit, tend to do really well when it comes to their storage ability. Sometimes they may last maybe 1 to 2 months, if not longer, based on the conditions being right for this. Sometimes varieties are a little bit more finicky. Macintosh, for instance, really likes to be about 36 degrees Fahrenheit. On the opposite of this, though, if you've got pears, you actually want to have them unripened and stored. So that should be 30 to 32 degrees, and they should last for about 1 to 3 months. They tend to be about 90% humidity is what they're after, compared to that 90 to 95%. When you're thinking about storage, though, you're having to factor in, the bags you're storing it in, you're thinking about all those kind of factors. And you may even find that a cold basement could provide what you need when it comes to what you're planning to store. As far as seasonal management goes, winter right now, this is pruning. This is thinking about training branches. Spring and summer, you're going to get into insect pest control. You're going to apply aged manure, compost, kind of keeping the area weed-free. So a yearly application of manure or aged manure would be fine for fruit trees. In summer, look to utilize any traps for insects, clean up the bad fruit, and then in fall, rake, remove leaves as far away as possible, especially for apple scab. You'll note here, I didn't even tell you to harvest. Yes, harvest your apples and your pears. That should go in there. But recognize there's some other things you got to do too. So we're getting wrapped up today. Feel free to go ahead and put some questions in the chat box and we'll try to answer them. We know we've got some time to do such. Just want to mention that we do have 2 additional Zoom webinars coming up, January 20th and 26th, for an intro to fruit tree pruning class. One is from at 12 p.m. I think next week's is 12 p.m. to 1:30. The week after is in the evening from 6 to 7:30. And then February, we have events Thursday and Fridays, State Line Fruit and Vegetable Growers Conference. This is geared a bit more for commercial production, just kind of keep that in mind. And yet we've got some topics that I think for beginning growers, or maybe even if you want to do some new pumpkin varieties in the backyard or grow in high tunnels and hard cider production even, you might be interested in. So that's why I can include that one as well. So as we get wrapped up today, if you are going to put out new fruit trees this season for apples and pears, you've got 4 decisions. Certainly you need a cultivar. You want to think about what that cultivar is going to be, and you then want to think about the height. Semi-dwarf, dwarf would probably be what I would lean towards. If it was something that you really recognize that what you're getting into, you could probably get away with the standard tree. Look towards disease resistance for apple scab and fire blight. And then also consider the whip and the feathered. So your first 3 decisions, cultivar, height, disease resistance, would be my main 3. And then, if it's a whipped or a feathered, all right, that's your kind of last decision. But the first 3 are going to make or break the long-term orchard that you might be planning. Ensure that you have fruit tree matches. Yes, the nursery should be pretty good about wanting to get you to buy another tree, but just make sure that you've got the right matches in there and they're blooming at the same time. The resources I've talked about today, I will send your way, so you will have those. If you have any current trees, implement those good practices, pruning, disease insect management. Those are all things that can really help ensure that your apples and pears are really productive for the season to come. And then I always suggest, expect mostly good seasons. These are very good yielding fruit trees in the backyard. When we compare them to some of the other fruits we'll talk about in our series, you run into some seasonal issues a lot of times with the others. These can be a little, they need some attention, and they sometimes encounter those late spring frosts and other things. But for most of the case, I think you're going to find very good seasons for them in our Northern Illinois area. So that's my email address. That's my phone number. You'll get an email from me today with additional resources. Next week, we'll be talking about stone fruit along with other fruit trees and kind of some other fruits I had in mind. If there were any that you were particularly interested in, you could send me an email and I'll try to make sure we cover those in next week's class. I've got some ideas as far as some weird ones, aronia and nectarines and pawpaws, some of those other unique fruit trees that we don't see a lot about to talk about. But yeah, feel free to do that. So I'm going to turn on my camera so you can see me, and I am going to go through our chat box with some questions. All right. Let's see, there was a question about disease resistance of Zestar. Zestar is one from Minnesota. I believe it has some pretty good disease resistance. I think a lot of the ones coming out of Minnesota are really focused on having some disease resistance in there for the apple scab and the fire blight. So I would fully expect Zestar to have something, knowing full well that it was one that was bred for commercial production. Additional question about a recommendation for clayey soils. Those can be a little bit more challenging. I think that if you were going to grow your fruit trees in the clay soils, you might try to add some additional compost or aged manure in there to help kind of address drainage. And it might be a seasonal thing too. As much as we might try to recommend having an area as weed-free as possible, it might be beneficial to have a bit of a wood mulch layer there to keep maybe some of the water from going into that clay. And then maybe in the fall, you pull back that mulch layer in some ways. So I think there's ways to do it, ways to kind of address it, because I think really apples and pears, they're all going to have similar kind of soil needs. I think you just might need to add some aged manure or some compost. And then as the season goes along, have that mulch layer, but then pull back that mulch layer in the fall or winter so that that doesn't cause a wildlife problem, would be my kind of suggestion on that. Steve commented, water sprouts are what you would prune and keep aside wood if you intend to propagate by grafting to rootstock. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of good things with those water sprouts where you could do when it comes to grafting. And I know there's a lot of folks that really like that idea of grafting with that rootstock. I know a lot of folks that have actually removed trees, left the trunk, and then they've actually come through and kind of very much grafted onto that rootstock itself. None of your charts included the Liberty apple variety. Do you have any experience with that type? So the charts were a little limited when it came to all the varieties out there. So because it wasn't on the chart doesn't mean that it's not recommended. It would work fine. It just was a chart where they were just pulling together a couple of ones. But yeah, Liberty we see good success with. I think it works really well as a cider tree. I think you could also have some really good success with it as probably an all-purpose one. A bit more of an older heirloom variety. I know we have a Liberty tree in our family orchard that tends to grow pretty well, and the fruit's pretty flavorful too. I think you also find the Liberty ones you may find rootstocks where the Liberty is grafted on, and it has some of that good disease resistance that we'd like. Dave asked, what's the best way to control Japanese beetles? You know, I had a slide on Japanese beetles and I thought, no, let's not put a slide on Japanese beetles today. So Japanese beetles can be heavily destructive, especially the first couple of seasons. If you have a dwarf or a semi-dwarf tree, you might actually look to put a barrier like a floating row cover in place. And so it's kind of like creating this barrier to keep the Japanese beetles from getting to those very young leaves. That would be one recommendation, and that was something I had to do with some of my younger trees this season. We usually don't recommend Japanese beetle traps. The reason for Japanese beetle traps not being recommended is that they will attract way more Japanese beetles than you would ever have in your area. That being said, you know, if you had property, if you had acres of property, folks have had a good success putting Japanese beetle traps, those bags, all the way away from their fruit trees to keep them from being a problem. You know, a lot of the sprays that are available to Japanese beetles to control them do have some negative effects on pollinators. So that's something to kind of keep in mind, is that you may have some good success with these sprays for Japanese beetles, but sometimes you can't always time it right when it comes to the fruit producing as well as any pollinator activity that might be happening. We usually don't recommend milky spore. Milky spore is that kind of soil treatment that you put into a grassy area that these can address some of those grubs before they start producing. In most cases, it's not necessarily addressing everything. So it means that, okay, you're addressing it in your area, applying this milky spore solution into the soil, but people from other places around you perhaps are not addressing that. So now the Japanese beetles are moving in. They're very good flyers. So it's a very complex answer. You know, I would try to have a barrier in place if you could to keep some of the Japanese beetles out of the way. Of course, that could also keep pollinators from getting to your trees. You could use a trap if it was very, very far away on your property. Probably would not recommend a milky spore. And of course, there are some insecticides. You just want to be mindful of using them. Try to use them in the evening because they can sometimes have negative effects on pollinators. It's the one insect that's just really, especially, it's just really hard to control. I mean, all of them are hard to control, I get it, but that one especially because it's heavily destructive. One thing you might also find is that if the Japanese beetles loved a particular vegetable or fruit that you were growing, use that as your trap or use that as your sacrifice. You know, I know they love grapevines. I know that they sometimes like other particular fruits, and maybe that's your sacrifice. You're kind of pushing them in that one direction if you can.